What's going on, guys? Enjoy this video. It's a compilation of the entire Great Northern War, starting from part 1, ending with the lies episode. Enjoy and subscribe. Let's get into it right away. Welcome back, everyone. Of course, we're doing extra history. Let's do something different. Stay in Europe, but let's do the Great Northern War. I just learned about this recently, so I would love to kind of dive deep into this. Of course, you have Sweden being like the antagonist, or you say the antagonist, the protagonist. I'm not sure. One side you have Sweden. The other side you have a coalition of Russia. I'm losing my thoughts. I think Lithuania. You're gonna have Russia. You might have Austria. You might have Britain. You might have can't remember. You have basically a lot. Some of them. We'll learn. But basically, you have these two crazy fights going on this huge crazy fight going on in the northern part of Europe, because Sweden has gotten really powerful. I think it's Charles XII at this time. I think that's right. But anyway, it was either the 7th or the 12th. I can't remember the numeral. But anyway, let's jump right in and see what it's all about. Extra history. Make sure you go subscribe to them if you haven't already. Let's go.
1697. Sweden is one of the truly great powers of Europe, with an unstoppable army and an empire that nearly encircles the Baltic.
Now let's just look at that. They have modern-day Finland, basically parts of the Baltics. What would that be? Would that be Estonia? Oh man.
But as the church bells toll, the world knows the king is dead and his 14-year-old son is inheritor to the crown.
Oh.
The vultures begin to circle. The danger of empire is that the more you have that other people want, and the Swedish Empire was no exception. In this case, the lands of the Swedish Empire had drawn the attention of someone brilliant, dynamic, ruthless,
Peter the First,
and ambitious. The 25-year-old Peter the Great. Peter had a love of the West. He was drawn to all things European. He saw the future of Russia not to the south or the east, but chasing the setting sun. He saw that future in becoming part of the great European economic system. But there was one obstacle to this grand design. He needed a port in the Baltic. He needed a way his ships could sail west bearing Russian goods or projecting the might of Russian arms.
St. Petersburg.
But the Baltic ports that Russia had once held had all been gobbled up by the Swedish Empire. Now it was time to take them back. But Peter wasn't alone. The king of the Danes had long chafed under the idea that traditionally Danish land in southern Sweden had been taken from them by the Swedish Empire, and he longed to get it back. And Augustus, the king of Poland-Lithuania, found an intriguing prospect within the Swedish borders as well. You see, the Polish-Lithuanian king was an elected title without much power, but he wanted to become a hereditary monarch, ruling over Poland-Lithuania as many of the other monarchs of Europe ruled over their domain.
Poor Poland-Lithuania. Poor Poland-Lithuania.
Right on his border, just inside the Swedish territory, was the small province of Livonia. The nobles there offered to declare him their hereditary king if he would liberate them from the Swedish. This intrigued him. If he could get them to declare him king and then integrate them with Poland-Lithuania, it would go a long way toward achieving his larger goal of making a real kingship out of the Polish-Lithuanian crown. Soon, these three forces became secret allies against the Swedish. Things dragged on for a while as Peter continued to pretend to be a friend of Sweden, hoping to avoid a war with them until his current war with the...
Yeah, the same thing is going, just crazy. What an amazing two-front war that they are diving out of and jumping into.
The Ottomans could be wrapped up. But at last, in 1700, his allies moved ahead, striking at the Swedes without warning, though in a piecemeal and ill-coordinated fashion. 14,000 Polish-Lithuanian troops marched across the border of Livonia first and laid siege to the capital. But the Swedes counterattacked. The Polish-Lithuanian troops were shattered. Their general lay dead. Soon they were in full retreat back to the border. Then the Danes made their move, a move to which Charles XII, the boy king of Sweden, responded with unexpected vigor. With the energy of youth, Charles raised money from every quarter, bolstering the finances of the overextended
Really that young?
Swedish Empire and launching a force that he himself would lead. After daring naval maneuvers and a surprise landing, the stunned Danish forces capitulated.
That's pretty badass, though, to have that type of vigor at that age.
And left the alliance against the Swedes entirely. Meanwhile, Peter still stood by. It was the perfect time to press the Swedes, and he knew it, but still no word of peace had come from the Ottomans. At last, when the peace was signed with the Ottomans in the hottest days of summer, it was finally Peter's turn to act. And act he did. To support the now reeling Polish-Lithuanian forces, he raised a massive army and marched toward Livonia. His objective was Narva, a major town right on the Russian border. But in this age, with the mud and roads of Russia, an army of that size moved pretty slowly. It was November before they reached Narva. In the biting cold, they dug trenches into the frozen ground and prepared for a siege. But their guns did little, and their assaults were swept aside. So a real siege it became, to starve the town out. But once Charles XII had thrashed the Danes, he had wasted no time packing up his little army and moving it east to deal with the invasion of Livonia. Braving autumn storms on the Baltic, he personally led his forces toward the
Did I say he personally? He said that twice now. Was he there?
true test of their strength. Many of his counselors argued against this endeavor. After all, even if he got to Livonia, he'd have to march his troops 150 miles across wasted ground in the middle of winter. And if he actually reached Narva, he would be outnumbered at least 4-1. More than that, the Russians he planned to assault were dug in with siege works, defenses they'd been preparing for weeks. But the now 18-year-old Charles was not put off.
Okay, so that's... I thought he was like 14. Maybe he was at the beginning of this skirmish or whatnot. But... yeah, that's not that young. I mean, I guess it still is. Yeah, it still is. I was thinking of like in ancient times, but this isn't ancient times at all. This is modern history for the most part. That's very young.
He was spoiling for a fight. So with the same boundless energy he applied to everything, he launched his winter campaign. And thus it was that on the 30th of November, the young king assembled his 10,000 men against at least 40,000 Russians. They calmly began to prepare for an assault. The Russians watched this in disbelief. Peter, who was used to a much slower pace of warfare, thought that it was impossible that anyone could attack immediately after completing a march like Charles just had. So he had left the night before to attend business in Russia, leaving in command a subordinate who, in line with Peter's policy of bringing in foreign experts, was a foreigner who barely spoke Russian. The rain began to pour, and yet the Swedish army calmly continued to ready for an assault. The sky
Wow. Dang. Are they Swedes or Vikings?
darkened. A storm rolled in, the snow was pouring in sheets, sleet slashing at the troops. The blizzard blinded both sides. Fighting was impossible. Men stood shivering in regimental formation, weapons at the ready for a battle that wasn't gonna come. Charles's advisors suggested that he call off the assault. But then the roaring wind began to turn, and Charles's keen eyes saw it. During this brief window, the enemy would be entirely blinded by the snow. He ordered the advance.
Okay. That's ingenious.
2 columns hidden by a sea of white fell upon the Russian lines, which quickly began to break, shots flying high in the snow.
I mean, not very different environment, but it very much reminds me, we just did a video on Lake Trasimene, where the fog created the blindness to an enemy of Romans. So this is really, it's a stretch being a parallel, but still same kind of concept, utilizing Mother Nature to catch your enemy off guard.
Soon it was down to bayonet and saber in the Russian trenches.
Wow.
Most of the Russian troops were ill-trained levies and began to scatter before the Swedish veterans.
They routed them.
The Swedes had pierced the enemy line, and the Russian troops began
So Charles XII might be a very competent general. Jeez.
to melt away.
Very competent.
Soon it was a complete rout. Panicked Russian soldiers chased by ragged and wraith-like Swedes, appearing like ghosts from out of the snow. The men stampeded over one of the only bridges across the Narva River. Under the weight of so many panicked souls, it collapsed. Timber and stone and Russian bodies tumbling into the water below. Thousands of Russians were trapped. It was an impossible victory, a crushing blow. But now Charles had another objective. The King of Poland-Lithuania had yet to personally suffer at his hand, and Charles was not a man to let what he
He does not invade. There's no way.
considered to be a perfidious treachery go unpunished. So, though Peter greatly feared a Swedish advance into Russia, and began immediately patching together a second force for defense of the motherland, Charles did not pursue Peter's deeply wounded army. Instead, he wintered in Livonia and prepared to bring the fight to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth the following year. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe had tumbled into the chaos of the War of the Spanish Succession. So preoccupied they were with the events in the West that they were no longer engaged enough in the events of the East to serve as arbiters or brokers for peace. In fact, diplomats and ministers wrote to Charles to tell him that he had a singular opportunity.
Obviously, you know, Russia, Austria, England, Great Britain, and France would be like those voices of reason at this point.
He could tip the scales of Europe. If he would make a victorious peace with the powers he had just crushed, he could determine the outcome of the Spanish War and decide who would inherit the vast lands of the Spanish crown.
That's insane, because that's such a far way away, yet he has ambition for that.
Play it right, and he could ensure another 100 years of preeminence for the Swedish people. But he never responded to any of these letters. He had his sights set on only one thing: war. So join us next time as we explore the
Great start to this series. Welcome. We have another extra history video. Great Northern War, Part 2. A good plan. So, of course, Charles XII, 18-year-old Charles XII, has taken the Danes out of the war. Kind of taken Peter and the Russians out of the war. They're kind of in the defensive position. They're not out of the war by any means. They're kind of just in the defensive position right now after their rout. And now Charles XII is wintering in Livonia. And now he wants to move south against Poland, or Polish-Lithuania. What will Augustus do? How will they beat them? Let's see what happens. Thank you for being here. Let's go.
his victorious army upon the war. With the Russians and the Danes effectively out of the war, Charles planned to descend with the full force of his victorious army upon the one enemy that remained to him, Augustus, King of Poland-Lithuania.
I love this channel.
Now, you would think that the situation would be looking pretty grim for Poland-Lithuania. They've just finished getting kicked around, they're basically out of money and resources, they're politically fractured, and their allies have essentially all dropped out of the war.
And then the other allies that could have helped them are worried about the Spanish succession in the West.
People would back out now, find a diplomatic solution, see if they could cut their losses. But Augustus had a new plan. Just keep losing. He made
Just keep digging.
a few half-hearted attempts at peace, figuring that if he didn't really put a lot of effort into it, he could get right on to losing some more. So when Charles XII basically ignored his call for peace, Augustus gathered his generals and said to them, "Guys, we really absolutely cannot let the Swedes cross the Dwina River, or hoo boy, are we gonna lose a lot. Wink wink nudge nudge." And with that, his commanders set out to meet what supporting troops
Well, it looks like Russia's aiding them.
the Russians could give them, which surprisingly was actually more men than they were fielding themselves. Proceeding with
I mean, Russia has a ton of men, though.
the plan, the main Polish-Lithuanian commander managed to deceive himself into thinking that the Swedes were going to land miles from where they were, and went personally with the best of his troops to defend a place where really nobody was going, all while leaving two non-military men basically in charge of the real army. Unaware of this, and so undaunted by Augustus's fearsome plan, Charles XII landed where everybody knew he was going to land all along, except for this master of self-deception. Yet still, despite all of this, the odds for the Polish-Lithuanian forces seemed pretty good. They outnumbered Charles 3-1, and they were dug in, while Charles would have to manage an amphibious landing and assault their entrenched positions.
I mean, so similar to, whenever he originally went up against Peter the Great, he was outmatched, kind of unfavorable odds. So what happens this time?
As dawn just barely broke through the darkness, the Swedes filled boats with damp straw and set them alight, sending them sailing towards the shore, great plumes of smoke obscuring their approach. The Polish-Lithuanian cannonades fired, and the clever floating counter-batteries of the Swedes sang. Under this bombardment, the troops approached, and in the first vessel against all entireties sat the Swedish king.
This guy thinks he's in the movie. When do you see a monarch this involved? I mean, maybe, there are contemporary monarchs the same involvement as this guy. He's young, he's just spontaneous, bodacious, and tactical with the art of war, using these crazy tactics to create intangibles for his troops to have the ability to win on unfavorable conditions.
Charles XII. He landed with his grenadiers. The Polish-Lithuanian troops fell upon him, planning to push him back into the waves, but they faced the best of the Swedish regiments, led personally by their king. The Swedes did not falter. The Polish-Lithuanian troops fell back, and the Russians fled in a screaming panic, many having never fired a shot. At last, though, the Polish-Lithuanian commander returned with all the troops he had taken.
There's just no discipline on the coalition side
with him, and the Polish-Lithuanian forces assailed the Swedes again. But Swedish reinforcements had now landed, and they were now much greater in number. Again, the Poles and the Lithuanians were beaten back, and then a third time, at which point the Polish-Lithuanians were basically like, you know what, screw this, let's go home. Which was a pretty good thing for Charles, because having come from ravaged Livonia, he basically started this whole campaign with no supplies whatsoever. He did manage to capture plenty.
What kind of Alexandrian campaign was he on? Because famously Alexander did not have enough supplies but for a battle.
After the battle, though, and was now well on his way to being ready for a good long fight. Augustus, realizing now that the Swedes were clearly not caving before his plan to just keep losing, went back to the drawing board. Now he had an even better plan. Now he would just keep losing even more. And so, while Charles wintered in Wergen...
I would get if he was like, I'm not going to face him like a Fabian strategy, but what do you mean he's just going to keep losing? Seems like a retroactive explanation.
Throwing snowballs at his officers and breaking their windows so that they didn't fall too much in love with comfort, Augustus prepared for his next near miss. This time, he was to get himself trounced in a swamp. It was a...
Yeah, let's go get infections and disease, guys.
Near-run thing for a while. For a moment, it looked like the Polish-Lithuanian forces might accidentally prevail. Augustus was in a good position, surrounded by woods and boggy terrain. He outnumbered the Swedish forces 2-1, and there was just no way the Swedes were gonna drag their cannon through that morass. It was touch and go for a bit, hard fighting for the Swedish forces, who were, as usual, exhausted from Charles's relentless marches. So then Augustus, nice fellow that he was, managed to let the Swedes take over his camp and turn his own artillery on his troops while they tried to retreat through a marsh.
Dang.
Yet still, Charles was not cowed by Augustus's mighty strategy of just keep losing forever. And so Augustus refined his plans even further. He realized now that this...
does he think of it as a meat grinder and attrition?
This approach had been too complex thus far, too multifaceted. He would now simplify it, put it in layman's terms. His new plan was losing, keep doing it. So Charles rode up to the gates of Krakow and shouted, "Open the door!" And when the guards peeked out to see who this shouting man was, Charles personally forced the gate and held it, while 300 of his men who, not quite...
Bro, is this true? I'm just as dumbfounded at this point. It sounds like a fiction tale at this point, like an epic.
Quite prepared for this, charged through anyway. And so it was that Charles took the great Polish city of Krakow with a handful of men armed only with unloaded muskets and canes. You've got to hand it to Augustus. That was some solid losing. But even this did not make Charles quit in disgust. And so, after being deposed by Charles XII, who elevated another king in his place, Augustus spent some time thinking. Pondering for a while and furrowing his brow, he at last came to one resplendent, crystal-clear idea. He had thought the one sentence that he needed to think, and that sentence was, "Cool. Now seems like a good time for a civil war." So Augustus raised his banner against the new king. But the Civil War began slowly. Augustus assembled his
Like I said, it sounds like a retroactive explanation. It seems like he had
forces in the Duchy of Saxony, while the Russians ravaged Sweden's Baltic provinces, which really had little to do with Poland-Lithuania, but, you know, good times. Meanwhile, Charles laid siege to the ancient fortress of Thorn, where he won surprising praise from the Polish people, as
now, doesn't look like the Civil War's going his way. Augustus's way, then.
when the city fell, he treated it with remarkable gentleness, letting captured men return to their families, even driving a herd of cattle and a flock of sheep into the city so that the starving defenders could eat. But once things got going, the whole war teetered back and forth, with Augustus recapturing Warsaw while Charles was out trying to compel parts of Poland-Lithuania to support his puppet king, and then Charles swooping back in to retake the capital while Augustus beat a retreat. But by 1705, the dominoes began to fall. The Great Poland-Lithuanian Plan was to crush the Swedes between the hammer of Augustus's forces marching from the west and the Great Russian Anvil to the east. But Augustus's forces ran into a tiny Swedish contingent outside of Warsaw, 1,900 cavalry and just 60 infantry. The Polish-Lithuanian commander, with his 10,000 men, was certain of victory. His forces rushed against this small band of Swedes, but somehow, by sheer grit, the Swedish cavalry, despite being outflanked or almost encircled by the overwhelming number of the enemy, threw back their attackers.
I'm sure they both had guns, right? There's no way these guys just had lances and swords or sabers, right?
And then, at the last minute, the 60 infantrymen emerged from the tall rye grass where they'd been hiding.
Yo, this guy is Hannibal.
The surprise turning the Polish-Lithuanian effort to regroup into a rout. Predictably, something similar happened to the Russians in the east, and soon the iron was beating up both the hammer and the anvil. And for the sake of brevity, this just keeps happening all over, both in open battle and in sieges. The Polish-Lithuanian forces and the Russian forces just keep getting crushed. But Augustus made one more push for Warsaw. Here again he was intercepted by a force half his size, but this time superior in cavalry. His commander tried to hide which of his troops were Russian by having them turn their uniforms inside out, but
funny.
even this clever ruse did no good. The Swedish commander realized which part of the line was made up of Russian conscripts
This is so funny.
and assaulted it with all of his force, swinging his cavalry in from the rear and
Sorry for pausing so much, but so I guess the Russians were either a liability or the strongest, one or the other.
the side. Meanwhile, the rest of the army was rendered useless by assaults on both flanks, the Swedish commander copying a page from Hannibal's book and
Literally what I said.
managing to envelop the enemy forces with his smaller army, much as Hannibal did at Kenny. Soon, the army was in full retreat. But with their superior cavalry, the Swedes were able to cut them off, and the retreat became an unconditional surrender. No longer able to field an army, Augustus was forced to sign a humiliating peace, giving up his king.
Very much, but yeah, it's like I wonder how much Napoleon looked to Charles VI or Charles XII here, because it feels like a combination of Hannibal and Napoleon, and it's funny because it's literally in the middle of the two, except for a lot closer to Napoleon versus Hannibal.
Kingship, abandoning his alliance with Russia, and acknowledging Charles's puppet king of Poland-Lithuania. But Augustus is not done yet. Eventually, he would stumble upon a novel, new, and arguably better idea: winning. So join us next time as the two greatest...
Right, yeah, I think, yeah, that's definitely like an effect, right? I could call it versus like a strategy. It feels like it's a retroactive explanation of what happened versus like the actual strategy. I don't know. I'm just straw picking. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. The Great Northern War continues. This is part 3. We're just going to jump right into it. Make sure you go see the other 2 parts if you haven't already. The Great Northern War, of course, Sweden, and the coalition. Let's see what happens now.
Fair two houses, both alike in dignity, in fair northern Europe. Wait a minute. With Poland-Lithuania out of the fight, Charles XII sets his eyes on another foe, the Russian giant,
Okay, yeah, so Russia's not out of the fight yet.
Peter the Great. While Charles had run roughshod over Poland, Peter had taken advantage of the moment to once again assail the Baltic provinces. He was stopped short of his ultimate goal, but Peter's efforts there were not without gain.
Of course, remember Peter's idea, he wants to get a warm water port to be more western.
His armies carved a path all the way to the Swedish fortress of Nyenskans, which he tore down to build an even greater fortress, the Peter and Paul Fortress, which would serve as the cornerstone for his most ambitious project of all.
St. Petersburg, yeah, I was about to say it. Those things stood for 200 years. I think you have the Decembrist revolts. Was it? Decembrist revolts might happen. I can't remember when they actually happened. I think early 19th century. But I was questioning that then when we did those. Anyway, let's jump back in.
St. Petersburg. He would erect a new city here, one grander and more modern than anything Russia had ever seen. This would be his gateway to the West, his port that tied Russia into the economic life of Europe. It would be his new capital, on which he would spare no expense, in treasure or lives. This was to be the culmination of his legacy, the embodiment of all his ideas on westernizing Russia, on becoming a naval power, on embracing European art and science and culture. But for that to be the case, Russia would have to succeed in holding on to these gains, something that Charles XII could not abide. Throughout 1704 and 1705, Swedish forces tried to take Peter's great fortress, but time and again they were repelled. Soon costs
Is it like a big citadel?
Started to mount, and men that could ill afford to be lost died for little gain. So Charles revamped his strategy and blockaded St. Petersburg. While the blockade dragged on, he began marshalling his main force for a march to the east. It was at this point that Russia sent him a peace offer. In return for an armistice, Russia would give up all of their gains, except for St. Petersburg and the forts connecting it to Russian territory. But Charles was having none of it. He knew how important St. Petersburg was. Why, with his invincible army, should he give it up? So Charles marched east, braving horrible weather and dangerous crossings to move with his traditional lightning speed. As he pressed forward, Peter fell back and back. Each defensive line Peter's commanders had planned to entrench was taken before their men could even unpack their spades. But even this march could not make up for the time Charles had lost trying to make Poland support his puppet king. In the years that had followed his initial victories over the Russians and the Polish-Lithuanian forces, Russia had not only seized and fortified what would become St. Petersburg, but reinforced it, and kept reinforcing it. Yet, the Swedish army was strong. Their king was able, their officers daring and intelligent. Top members of the military thought that it would be a tough fight, but that they could take St. Petersburg. They drew up plans and submitted them to the king, who swore them to utmost secrecy about the plans they had concocted. And so the officers marched, thinking their objective to be St. Petersburg. But soon they found themselves near
Minsk? In Belarus?
Minsk. Wait a minute, that wasn't on the way to St. Petersburg. Charles had marched them in a different direction, and there was only one place they could be going from there. He was marching them to Moscow. Charles's officers had told him that they were not ready, that striking so deep into Russia was simply too great of a gamble.
Didn't we learn? Did we learn yet? No, we haven't. This is just another example of scorched earth, probably. And I'm just so guesstimating this.
It was something the army simply wasn't prepared for. But how many times before had Charles been told that something was too great a gamble? How often had he heard that something was impossible?
Is he gonna pull a Napoleon and be great up until invading Russia?
Only to then achieve it himself. He had made up his mind. They would not waste their time retaking lost territories. He would unseat Peter himself. The first two rivers they crossed with little opposition, being slowed only by the fact that the retreating Russian forces burnt every bridge along
So scorched earth, basically.
the way.
Sort of.
Tartar horsemen also harassed them continually, but this seemed
Instead of Cossacks, you have Tartars. Look, the parallels are uncanny.
a minor nuisance. They were making good time through bad country. But then, at the Wabis River, they found a large enemy force barring their passage. The position held by the Russians was daunting. The Swedes would have to traverse marshy ground to get to them, and beyond that was a forest which might hide yet more troops. But Charles saw a way. The enemy line had a gap in it along a swampy area that the Russians clearly thought was impassable. Charles personally led his army across 1,500 yards of killing ground to reach this swampy area. At one point, his men were shoulder deep in water. The enemy line was split.
That's gotta have like disease-ridden like bacteria all in. Maybe not. It's a river. Yeah, maybe not. It's a river.
The Russians tried to use numbers to heal the breach, but heroic actions from the Swedish cavalry prevented any joining of Russian arms. Soon the line began to collapse. The crossing was theirs. Once again, the Swedes had triumphed against impossible odds.
I mean, I'm being very impressed right now with Charles and the Swedes.
But keen observers in the army would have noted that though the Swedes emerged victorious, these Russian troops were made of sterner stuff than they had been 8 years back. Tactics and firm soldiering had been hammered into them since their retreat at Narva. They would not be turning and running like that anymore. This victory left Charles's army exhausted. It would take a month of rest before he could really move them again. And during this month, Peter was not idle. Peter stripped the land bare. He laid waste to any stretch of ground that the Swedes would have to cross.
And is this the precedent for that? Or did they do that before with the Mongols? That when it started.
And even though it was his own country, and the suffering caused to his own people was immense, Peter made no half measure of it. Every grain of wheat was carted off. Every pasture where a horse might graze was turned to ash. There would be nothing but wasteland for the Swedes to traverse. Thus began a time of suffering for the Swedish forces. When they resumed their march, food was scarce, and with scarce food came disease. This victorious army began to march as defeated men, with hollow eyes and weary steps. Charles continued to rally them, but he had no real answer to this predicament. He had been counting on living off the countryside as they marched. Their supply lines were stretched beyond their limit. Many asked him to turn home, but he believed in Swedish
This seems like uncanny.
arms. He believed that if he could just force Peter into one decisive battle, they might yet win this war. But Peter demurred. He would not give Charles the battle he wanted. And so the Swedes marched across fields of ash, seeing always in the distance villages alight, candles in remembrance to Peter's uncompromising policy of starvation. In frustration, Charles turned to his officers and asked their advice. They recommended that the army fall back to the Dnieper and meet up with a relief force laden with supplies. But this would be tantamount to giving up the campaign, so Charles asked for other options. Reluctantly, it was suggested that the Ukraine had not been as thoroughly plundered. It might be possible to gather supplies there and enlist the aid of friendly Cossacks, but such a move would
Friendly Cossacks? Oh, interesting.
cut the army off from any real ability to communicate with Swedish territory or get resupply from the Empire. Still, Charles saw it as a possible path to victory where retreat offered none. His officers pleaded with him to at least wait for the relief force and their provisions, but Charles, fearing that further delays would only give Peter more time, turned the army toward Ukraine immediately. They would now retrace their steps until they could turn south, walking back across the same blasted waste from which they had just come. But as summer gave way to autumn and autumn to winter, a chill set in. Then a deep cold. Then a freezing, bone-gnawing frost. And not just any frost. This was what is known today as the Great Frost.
Oh.
The coldest winter Europe has experienced in 500 years.
Oh.
Rivers froze from the Thames all the way down to the lagoons of Venice. And this frost served Peter well. By the time the winter of 1708 and 1709 came to an end, Charles had only 20,000 remaining men able to fight, less than half the number he'd begun this campaign with. Half of his undefeated army lost. But there's still hope yet. Join us next time.
That's insane. Well, I guess the only good thing is that he turned back when he did. But he's brash. What I've been saying, he's bodacious. It's uncanny the parallels between him and Napoleon. And I said that before he even invaded Russia. It just felt that way. He has like the Hannibal tactics, but like a Napoleon demeanor. Can't wait to get to the next parts. Welcome back, guys. I hope you're doing well. We're continuing the Great Northern War, of course. We have Sweden, we have Russia, we have other people as well. Polish Lithuania, Denmark at one point, and then we're gonna have some other characters, it looks like, in the future. But now we just got done seeing the insane scorched earth policy of Peter the I, which I don't know if it's the precedent for the scorched earth policy or if it's just one of many. But Sweden lost a lot. Lost a lot during that. They did pull back, so they didn't lose a ton, but they lose a lot, which equates to whatever. But yeah, so we're gonna jump into it. Part 4. This is called Clash of Kings. I'm gonna see what that means. Let's jump right in.
Teague had narrowed all the possibilities of this war down to one stark inevitability. Peter and Charles would meet on the field of battle to decide the fate of the Baltic world. Charles had brought his forces into the Ukraine. He hoped his army would be able to live off the land. More than that, though, he hoped for 2 great reinforcements. First, he hoped to meet with the supply train that he had opted not to meet up with on the retreat from the Moscow campaign. And second, he hoped to engage Ukrainian Cossacks to serve as his allies.
Okay.
But now Peter himself was on the field. As the supply column that had been supposed to provide relief to Charles XII turned south to meet with the main army, Peter intercepted it. The initial fighting was fierce. Again, the Swedish army was half the size of the Russian force. But despite this, for a moment, it looked as though they might shatter the Russian forces anyway. This time, though, Peter was with his army, and with him, the hardened elite Russian guard, who stood firm and anchored the wavering line. The fighting turned into a brutal slog. By nightfall, neither side had made any conclusive blow. Both sides withdrew with the setting sun, the Russians to the nearby woods, and the Swedes to their defensive position. The Russians settled in to rest, but the Swedes stayed in battle formation, fearing...
That's... Depending on how this goes, Russians are getting some really good rest, or are they going to get caught off guard because they're resting?
Another attack. As the night drew on, though, it became clear that no new attack was coming. So, rather than fight against rested and reinforced Russian troops with his exhausted army, the Swedish commander ordered a withdrawal under the cover of dark. But as they crossed the muddy ground behind them, the wagons and the artillery began to get stuck, slowing them down.
I need all-terrain tires from Goodyear.
Abandoning some of their artillery and baggage, they managed to make it to the nearest town, but the bridge they needed to truly make their escape had been burnt by a Russian detachment. Seeing this, the men began to panic. But the Swedish commander made the tough choice. They would unload the wagons, carry what supplies they could, and burn the rest.
They're gonna do some scorched earth themselves? Okay.
Unfortunately, in these wagons was, amongst other things, the army's alcohol ration.
Oh no. Why do y'all have alcohol rations? How does that impact the war effort?
Weeks worth of it. Such a waste. So as the men began to unpack, many of them also took the opportunity.
And I know, they didn't have a ton to drink. They didn't have tons of stuff to drink back then. They still have water.
To consume the liquor that they would be throwing away. Soon, the army was drunk. Men got lost in the woods. Others had to be left behind. The orderly Swedish retreat dissolved into a chaotic flight. What few men were still good for fighting were given mounts, and these few thousand troops made their escape. No supplies from this caravan would ever find their way to Charles and the Ukraine. Charles's other hope for succor was a man named Ivan Stevanovich Mazepa. Ivan had grown up the bastard son of a minor Polish noble, but as a young page in the Polish court, he had been caught in flagrante with a married nobleman's wife. He had been promptly tarred and feathered, then tied to a horse. With Ivan's face firmly tied to the horse's rear, the horse had been sent packing, running off unguided into the wild. Everyone had expected that Ivan would die on the Ukrainian steppe, but Cossacks had found him, untied him, and gave him a home in their tribe.
Nice.
Valorous and ambitious, he had risen within their ranks until, when he was 48, the tribe had unanimously elected him to lead them. For years, he had ably served Peter the Great, but secretly he had always hoped to be free of Peter, to create an independent kingdom for his Cossacks.
I can't remember when this takes place. Turn of the century or the 18th century, We'll go 100 years and you'll still have the Cossacks being a prominent role, step in Ukrainian and Russian wilderness. I'd love to learn more about them. It seems they're such an interesting group of people.
When Charles had begun rampaging through Poland, Ivan began to negotiate with him. After all, this Swedish king might have a real shot at overthrowing the Russians. Charles never took these overtures too seriously, though, at least not until desperate circumstances forced him to. As his campaign to Moscow began to fall apart, he reconsidered the value of this Cossack hetman. He agreed that, in exchange for the 30,000 horsemen that Ivan said he had under his command, the Swedes would offer their protection to the Cossacks. It was with the intent to meet up with this force that Charles turned southward. It was for this Cossack force that he abandoned the inebriated and ill-fated resupply train that was originally meant to catch up with him. Charles needed these troops, and the sooner he could link up with them, the better. But Ivan Mazepa had severely overestimated the Cossacks' loyalty to him. When he made his rebellion known, it was 3,000 Cossacks.
Oh, 10x difference. That's not going to be good.
Not 30,000 that decided to follow him. The rest maintained their allegiance to Peter. Peter then burnt...
Because a lot of them probably have family that way. Maybe they just think of themselves more Russian, so a treasonous thing to do.
Burnt Ivan's capital and sent the bodies of Cossacks tied to crosses floating down the Dnieper.
Wait, what? Wait, I missed something.
Decided to follow him. The rest maintained their allegiance to Peter. Peter then burnt Ivan's capital and sent the bodies of Cossacks tied to crosses floating down the Dnieper to discourage further rebellions.
Wow.
By the time Ivan struggled into Charles's camp, he had merely 1,500
That's a huge
men with him, and few supplies. Now cut off in the Ukraine, the situation for the Swedish army was desperate. They were using saltpeter instead of salt to preserve food. They didn't even have
What's the difference there?
Enough wine to give the sacrament to dying men. So Charles made a bold plan. He would attack the fortress of Poltava and gain a secure location for his men to rest and await supplies from the rest of his empire. But the privations of the winter had taken an even greater toll on his army. Almost all of his artillery had been left behind. They had almost no shot, and the powder had gotten so damp and waterlogged that men complained that when they fired they could see the balls drop to the ground 30 feet away.
Just go home at this point. Just go home.
They had also lost much of their officer corps, and now that it was summer, gangrene was spreading through the camp.
No.
But still, they put Poltava to siege. Each day they tried to mine underneath the fort and use sappers to drop its walls, but without artillery the going was slow. All the while, Peter raced toward Poltava with a massive relief army. And then, Charles's legendary luck finally ran out. While overseeing the siege works, a stray bullet caught him in the heel, passing straight through his foot and embedding itself near his big toe.
Ow!
That day, he rode and worked through the pain until his men noticed that he was ghastly pale.
Bro, you're gonna get infected.
When they took him to his tent and cut off his boot, they found that his foot was a wreck. He would have to be carried on a litter for at least the remains of the campaign. Then, Peter reached Poltava. His massive army of 80,000 dwarfed the 18,000-ish men of Charles's army that were actually in fighting remains of the campaign. Then, Peter reached Poltava. His massive army of 80,000 dwarfed the 18,000-ish men of Charles's army that were actually in fighting shape. This giant force arrayed itself in front of the fort and began to dig in. Still, Charles and his commanders chose to rely upon the expedient they had always relied upon: assault.
Not gonna go well.
At first, things go well. Swedes overrun the forward batteries and the assault sweeps forward. But then things begin to bog down. Inopportune orders are given. The Russian line is given time to firm up. Between the men left behind to guard the camp and those ordered to maintain the siege, even while the main fight is going on, the Swedish army is down to about 4,000 men. The order is given. They are to rush the entrenched Russian line. Cannon fire rips through the line of charging men. Bullets rain down upon them. By the time they reach the Russian works, nearly half of them lay bleeding on the field. The king orders his litter...
Oh my god, this is such a funny... Oh, that's such a funny image.
raced to the front to encourage his men. One by one, his litter bearers are shot dead around him, until only 3 of the original 24 remain. The
24? How are those 3 carrying it if it took... so many questions. Why is he... So many questions.
king's litter drops, smashed upon the ground. What few men are left surge forward, trying to prevent the Russians from capturing their king. A major rides up, dismounts, and lifts the king onto his own horse, only to be torn to pieces by Cossack sabers moments later. The king is whisked to safety, but at what cost? The army is routed, stumbling back across the steppe, disorganized. They need to cross the Dnieper to escape, but the Russians are fast on their heels. The Swedes are forced to make a difficult decision. The king is sent ahead with 1,500 of the fastest combat-ready cavalry they have left. The remainder of the army is transferred to one of the king's generals. 2 days later, with the Russians closing the army's line of retreat, 14,000 of what had once been the world's finest army surrender en masse. Can the king escape? Can the Swedes recover? Join us next week to find out.
That's crazy, isn't it? But, I mean, that's just how it goes. The highest of the class will always get out of there. The lowest of the lows will either be captured, enslaved, or killed. It's unfortunate events. It could be avoided if there was better logistics for the army. It seems that decision-making and logistics is the end-all be-all here. I mean, it was such a gamble to rely on the Cossacks to kind of like switch their allegiance based off of short-term results. Think about it, like initialized 30,000 troops went to 50. That is an insane swing. Insane swing. Like a 20, was that a 20x? A 20x difference. And then on top of that, you already have so many issues with the scorched earth policy from Peter, so dug in that you have a horrible war of attrition that you're fighting. And then on top of that, King gets shot in the foot. So he's kind of like bit on the front lines, and he still wants to be on the front lines. So you have a weird like situation going on there. So it's just so many things happening in the wrong direction for the army. And then when you have 80,000 Russians, there's not much you can do. Not much you can do. So we'll have to see where this goes, but it does not look good for Charles. They should just go back. Sweden at this point, cut their losses, as many losses as there are. Maybe swing a disarmament treaty to get your men back, but I don't know if you would have the leverage to. Crazy. Welcome back, everyone. We are continuing the Great Northern War. I believe this is the last actual part. We'll have a bonus part, of course, called Lies after this, so stay tuned for that. But this is called Rise and Fall. We had an extremely huge rise early on of Charles, I think the 12th. But how things have changed, just with logistical errors, too much pride, etc., etc. Glad you're here with me. Let's jump right in.
Hard on his heels. Ragged and battered, the tattered remnants of the Swedish army fly south. Charles hopes to find succor within the Ottoman Empire, but Peter is hard on his heels.
They should honestly just cut, like I said last time, cut their losses and go back home.
Nearly starving, suffering from the heat, the remaining Swedes raced south until they arrived at the very border of the Black Sea. But as the local prince haggled over prices for boats to ferry them into the Ottoman Empire, Peter overtook the Swedish rearguard. 800 were lost, only 500 remained. But those 500 made their way into the Sultanate. There they were treated regally, given food and drink, even allowed to set up an almost autonomous colony which the Ottomans
That's crazy.
helped them to build. But Peter did not relent. As his forces approached the border of the empire, he demanded that Charles be handed over. The Sultan, who was no friend of the Russians,
Of course.
refused, so Peter decided to force the issue. He would bring war to the Ottoman Empire itself. His army, augmented by forces from Moldavia, plunged towards Ploth River, where they were rapidly cut off by the giant home army of the Ottoman Empire. For a moment, it looked as though Peter and his entire force might fall into the Sultan's hands. But where Peter and his subordinates had clearly lost the war, you might argue that they won the peace. Deftly using diplomacy to extricate his army, Peter was allowed to leave the Ottoman territory with his army intact for little more than an agreement to give Charles safe passage back to Sweden, and a handful of very minor territorial concessions. But this was not good enough for Charles. He pushed the Sultan to make war.
The guy that has no leverage at all in this entire situation is going to be like, beggars can't be choosers. Currently a beggar.
On the Russians. The Sultan had no interest in such a costly project. He was basically like, we won you the right to go home, man. Just go home. Charles then decided to be the ultimate bad house guest and declared, all right, I live here now. To which the Sultan,
he's squatting,
replied, dude, come on. And Charles responded, I will cut you. At which point the Sultan, in his infinite patience, said, look, I will give you 10,000 pounds if you will just leave. Charles took this payment and then, like any bad house guest, said, all right, I will leave if you give me 8,000 more. At which point the Sultan was like, okay, time to call the sheriff, before remembering, oh wait, I'm the sheriff, and then promptly surrounded Charles's small force and threw him into jail. After cooling his heels for a while, Charles was, at last, allowed to return to Sweden. And it was at this point that good old Augustus the Strong, deposed King of Poland, returns to the spotlight. After having a good long think, he had finally decided, you know, I have heard good things about winning. New plan? Let's try that. He was super excited about this plan, and, I mean, why wouldn't he be? It's a pretty solid plan. Anyway, he proceeded to basically roll Swedish forces back to the very borders of Polish-Lithuanian territory.
So I'm guessing, like, he pushed back garrison troops? Not Charles's brigade?
Then, after a heroic last effort from the Swedish troops, he bottled them up in a fortress in Holstein-Gottorp, and, when no aid came to save them, he forced them to surrender. The last truly major army of the Swedes had vanished. So the dominoes began to fall. Russia, Norway, and Poland-Lithuania were already at war with Sweden. Those who had fallen out of the alliance due to previous defeats were now back in. Then the King of England got into the mix, under his other title as Elector of Hanover.
Okay, so it's gotta be George the First at that point.
And then so did Prussia. So at this point, Sweden is basically at war with all of Northern Europe. Their resources are tapped, and the great armies that had swept them to empire were now shattered or imprisoned. But Charles was not deterred. Never one to surrender, never one to make peace. He raised what forces he could and kicked off a campaign in Norway.
Oh my goodness. I thought we were coming to the credits at this point. But no. Now we gotta go fight Norway.
And this began pretty well. He cut his way through the thin Danish-Norwegian defenses, threatening to overwhelm the knife at the back of Sweden. But then disaster struck in the Baltic. Norwegian naval forces ambushed the Swedish fleet, nearly wiping it out. This left Charles unable to resupply, and he was forced to retreat once again. Meanwhile, in Finland, which was part of Sweden at the time, the Russians had invaded. Initially, the going was slow. The Russians were impeded by poor roads and bad weather, but Peter, with his love of ships, settled on a new course of action. One where the Russian offensive would be centered on the coastline, where men and material could rapidly be transferred by sea. The Swedish commander in Finland was continually on the retreat, having neither the men nor the supplies necessary to contest the Russians. For this,
is this where Finland falls to Russia? Like the territory of Finland?
He was recalled and replaced with a man who was much more likely to agree to the native Finns' demand for a fight. And fight they did, twice. But long gone were the days when Swedish forces could beat the Russians 8-1, or even 2-1. The Swedish army in Finland was almost entirely made up of Finnish troops, not the Swedish corps who had done so much at the outset of the war, only to be eventually wiped out in Russia. This Finnish army was beaten back both times. This all occurred just before the Swedish Navy got stomped outside of Norway, and I'm sorry for how confusing these timelines are, but at this point everything is kind of happening at once. The Swedish fleet was sent to help out the Finnish forces, to take some of the pressure off. But Peter, great lover of sailing ships that he was, ironically used a fleet of galleys to blaze past them on a day in which the sea was calm. Soon, the Finnish front was untenable, and what troops were left were recalled to defend Sweden itself. But Charles was not yet done. He planned...
It's crazy that there's not internal political pressure. There probably are happenings within Sweden right now when it comes to the political pressure. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure the landscape of how Sweden was during this time. Was it an absolute monarchy? Was it a constitutional monarchy? Was there two branches of government? Was there opposition to this war? There had to be opposition to the war, but how vocal was that opposition? How close to Charles was that opposition? Questions.
And a return to Norway. He knew there was exactly one hope. He needed to capture the fortress of Fredrikstad, the very same place he had just lost his fleet failing to capture. He raised another 22,000 men for his last attempt to turn things around.
Another thing I want to point out. Where's that? He has no allies. I mean, for like a blip, he had the Ottoman Empire. Like, where's your allies? Like, you're just, I don't know, man.
Their campaign in Norway was hard going, always in want of rations, having to swim across rivers or climb whole mountains to achieve the positioning that Charles wanted. But despite this suffering, Swedish discipline won out. And through this privation, the army never truly wavered, because they had always the example of their king, who always took the roughest tasks for himself. By November 1718, they made it to the fortress. Charles himself led an assault on the outerworks and overwhelmed them with his loyal grenadiers. Things were progressing nicely, but now the fortress had to be breached. On the 30th of November, Charles went to inspect the trench works. Laughing and joking with the men, he encouraged them in their work. Then, as night fell, the defenders put burning wreaths on the fortress wall to illuminate the surrounding ground. The king suspected that they might sortie out and try to smash the progress that had been made on the siege works before returning to the safety of their fort, so he climbed to the lip of the trench to get a better look. A nearby French officer, who had just joined the Swedes, called out to him, "That is no fit place for your majesty. Musket balls and cannonballs have as little respect for the king as for the common soldier." The king simply responded,
"This is foreshadowing, I just see it.
Don't be afraid." And one of the Swedish officers told the Frenchman, "Let him be. The more you warn him, the more he'll expose himself." The moon now washed the whole battlefield in a pale light. Soldiers worked, officers directed, and then there was a soft, wet sound, no louder than that of a rock gently dropped into a pool. The king was dead. A shot had passed through his left temple and out the right. He died where he lay, right at the top of the trench works. The succession passed to his sister, but the spirit of the army was gone. A retreat was made, and preparations to defend the homeland began. But defense was only a dream. From 1719 to 1721, Sweden suffered brutal raids and incursions from the Russians, until, at last, they were forced to make peace. Sweden had to cede almost all of its territory except for the home country itself and Finland, which, after an occupation known as the Great Wrath, the Russians agreed to leave be. The grand dream of Charles was smashed, and with it, the Swedish Empire. Sweden would never rise again to such a position of prominence on the world stage. But as Charles's dream lay in ruins, Peter's became a reality. Russia pushed westward, gaining ports along the Baltic coast. More importantly, they proved that they were a power on the rise, that no longer could calculations about European politics be made without factoring the Russians in.
Interesting.
Thus, the Great Northern War ends. And the wheel turns as one empire falls and another rises.
Wow, beautiful. Where's a good here? So guys, the Great Northern War. I've seen a lot of comments. I appreciate all the comments of contextual videos that might layer in more detailed showcases of what's happening within the Great Northern War, or the politics or the cultures of the certain states involved. Obviously, the three main Denmark, Norway, I think that was one state, but apparently it is. You have Poland, Lithuania, and then you have Russia. These three main adversaries to Sweden. And then, of course, Charles dies. I did not expect Charles to die at the end of the series. I didn't know that he would. He's been fearless, though. Like, he's definitely come across death a few times. Honestly, I thought he probably would die whenever he got shot in the foot because of his arrogance. I thought he was going to contract an infection and die, actually. However, that didn't happen yet. But, you know, the foreshadowing of him peering over the thing, who knows? You know, some things are romanticized over time, but that might have been the case where he just peeked over. People said don't. He still did it. He died. And then I thought for sure Finland would be ceded to the Russians after the, but it wasn't. So something has to happen later. Yeah, crazy. We have the lies episode next, which is more or less filling in the gaps. If you guys have any video suggestions that relate to the Great Northern War, please down below. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace out. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. The Great Northern War lies. Extra history. We have completed the series. Now we must see what they are forgotten and where the gaps are filled. Glad you're here with me. Let's jump right in.
Hello everyone and welcome to Lies, the part of the show that I normally use to talk about the mistakes we made and the flags we bought.
What do you mean normally? Do something different? What the crap is that sword? That's an insane sword in the background.
But as you can probably tell from my scruff and the beautiful decor, I am not exactly at home. I've been on the road for weeks. I've been stuck in airports forever due to some pilot strikes. So I'm gonna try something different this week.
Okay.
Because I'm 1,000 miles away from where Soraya is, so we can't do the back and forth that we normally do. I'm gonna answer some of your questions instead.
Obviously, by the way, this is the second time I've ever done one of these lies videos. So yeah.
Every month we do a Q&A with the patrons, where they basically get to come on something kind of like Skype and ask us questions about the series. And this time, there were some amazing questions I really wanted to share with everyone. So I'm actually just going to answer their...
Probably some of my, not questions, I said, obviously, way older than recording now, but probably going to have some overlapping questions in my own internal mind that the individuals, you know.
Their questions live here. So with that, I got my trusty tablet, which I've just almost dropped, and I'm just going to dive into it. So first question, foreign politics question. Looks like everybody has some allies except Sweden.
I said that, but I guess Ottoman Empire, right? But besides that, who?
Is it really so, or is it only an impression and everyone's just piled up to get a cut of the losing side? It's sort of true, right? One of the areas that I feel like Sweden lost the Great Northern War is the diplomatic front. Early on, they were pretty good about being able to keep the sort of Western European powers like France and England out of the conflict. But as things got worse and worse, I mean, yes, everybody did want a part of it. And so you've got initially sort of your Swedish Empire versus...
a coalition. Literally a coalition.
Russia, Poland, and Denmark. And Poland's an interesting case even because the Poles didn't totally want to be in it. If you remember that guy Augustus the Strong, there's a whole bunch of weird, funny anecdotes about him. Like the fact that he would bend horseshoes with his hand, which is why he's known as Augustus the Strong.
You gotta be strong for that, depending on the metal.
And when playing a fun Germanic game called fox tossing, which is a game which is about you and your partner tossing a fox, and hopefully neither you nor the fox like getting horribly mauled by this activity, he would do it with one finger. He would help toss the fox. So he was named Augustus the Strong. But anyway, the important thing is he was not only King of Poland, he was the Elector of Hanover. And one of the areas that was kind of a lie in this is talking about him just as the King of Poland, because
Elector of Hanover, wouldn't that overlap some of the duties and or like umbrella coverage that George I would have.
He did a lot of this declaring war as the Elector of Hanover when the Poles didn't want to, and by also being the King of Poland, to drag Poland into it. But yes, you're absolutely right. It does seem like there's a bigger confederation against Sweden than for Sweden. The three nations were basically the initial confederation, and as time goes on, Charles is not a very diplomatic individual. There have been lots of other requests from Western Europe for him to do things differently or to make peace. When he refuses to do this, everyone piles up in the end. So you're correct. It actually is that Sweden is sort of isolated in this, and that's one of the major failings.
But for just like a second, it seems like the Ottomans were aligned a little bit, just because the enemy of my friend, the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation.
So, question 2. Did Sweden have a real shot at emerging the victor in the Great Northern War? If so, what would you say was the biggest turning point where this opportunity was lost?
No way against Russia, just given their manpower and their resources, right? But maybe they could have created, not like an all-out war, there's no way. But maybe they could have sued for peace if they were able to do something, right?
And how do you imagine history would have been different had this happened? Oh. So that's actually 3 questions, each of which I will try and tackle. So first off, did Sweden have a real shot at winning the Great Northern War? Yes, but only if you think about it this way. The Great Northern War didn't have to be the Great Northern War. There was that initial war where it was Sweden versus Poland, Russia, and Denmark, where basically they kicked around everybody, right?
Yeah, they beat Denmark initially, but they didn't really try to occupy or conquest that way. At least what it seemed like, right? The Poland-Lithuanian situation looked like they were doing a really good job there. It was just Russia that was the catalyst, right?
And then Charles refused to make peace, right? So there are sort of 2 wars that go on. That initial war, and then the war that continues when Charles makes the decision to invade Russia. If Charles had been willing to just stop when he had won, I think they could have made substantial territorial gains. And it would have been considered a minor war, which the Swedish Empire, which had been a continuously expanding empire, had again won, and would have sort of continued the trajectory of the Swedish Empire. But unfortunately, by Charles deciding to invade Russia, we get what we now know as the Great Northern War, this much larger, much longer conflict where Sweden gets utterly decimated due to their own hubris. So yes, it's possible if you think about the wars that happened. I mean, not only could they have won, but they did actually win the conflict. Then they went on to keep going. And
then they did exactly what Napoleon and Mustache Man would also fail to do, successfully invade Russia.
This is the problem for every great conqueror, right? It doesn't matter if it's Napoleon or Alexander. Almost every great conqueror we see in history ends up at this moment where they overextend because they don't know their own limits and aren't willing to just stop.
Well, Alexander was undefeated, right? I mean, there was definitely probably fallout afterwards, but it seems like Alexander was good in that regard.
So that sort of answers the second question. What was the biggest turning point here? It's this decision to invade Russia. If you look at the Swedish Empire at the time, it's a lot of territory, but a lot of that territory doesn't have a lot of people and doesn't have a lot of money. And so what they really needed to do was stop after the initial victories and consolidate their territory, consolidate their new gains, and build up economically before taking on a country as large and as populous as Russia. So it's really that moment where they refuse to make peace, even though a lot of the Western nations are asking them to make peace, even though there are peace overtures from Russia. And then how do I imagine history would be different? That's really hard to say. It depends on whether or not they're actually able to sort of consolidate economically. And if so, I think you might have seen a united Scandinavia. Instead of having Scandinavia be several countries as it is today, you
Really?
might have had one larger Scandinavian nation. And in that case,
I mean, it's not far off. I don't think that's a bad analysis at all. It could have happened.
you would have also had Scandinavia continue to play a larger role in the development of Europe over the next few centuries, and potentially even all the way to today, just by it being a larger, more populous, more economically vibrant entity.
It could be, it could have been who knows what would have happened? Like, would Prussia been able to develop itself into the unification of Germany as easily? And of course, you got the Schleswig-Holstein War, and then you have like the Prussian, like the big five. You have Austria, you have Prussia, Russia, France, and what if you five, and instead of Prussia, you have a greater Scandinavia.
Because although all those nations, especially today, are very vibrant economically, simply by pure size, they're not as impactful as one unified Scandinavia might have been. Ooh, this one's a really interesting one. Having done a series on Peter and Catherine the Great, what do you think of the empress who came between them, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I don't know. So about to learn.
So, I think that Elizabeth is a really good sort of example and test case for many of the competent czars and tsaritsas, tsarinas, empresses, and emperors in Russia. Elizabeth is herself plenty competent, right? Not quite as impressive as either Peter or Catherine, both who get the title the Great, but definitely a competent ruler. There is, though, this issue that sort of plagues Russia continuously. And that's that we see all these like coups and assassination plots and all this dynastic struggle, which means that almost all the rulers end up being justifiably, but very paranoid. And this was definitely
you definitely see that with Catherine.
True of Elizabeth as well as Catherine and Peter. And in being paranoid, they tend not to turn over a lot of power to their successor, right? Because you give a lot of power to your successor, you give a lot of power to the person who probably has the most at stake or most to gain from overthrowing you. But what does this mean? Well, that may be very smart policy personally, but it's very bad for running a nation, because it
it's less altruistic in that case.
means that each successor in line is not prepared, does not have a lot of the tools they need, don't have a lot of the connections they need, haven't been doing the job before.
And I mean, you can say the same. We just did, the series around, we didn't just about a month ago, around the Crusades, and you saw the Anglo-Saxon or Norman nations start to form around the Levant. And besides the Levant, you have, all the other nations of the caliphates around and all such for the Turkish nations. And it's so obvious. And it's just a pattern of continuation of history. It's so obvious to see, like, whenever there's not a strong succession plan, things create coups, usurpers, power vacuums create themselves out of thin air. So I guess I definitely understand what he's talking about here.
They're thrown right into it, haven't been working with the people who are essential to running the country. And so a lot of the problems, a lot of the negatives for Catherine's reign, to me, do fall out of that paranoia that comes from Elizabeth. At the same time, she did a lot to support Catherine at different times. And we see that Catherine has exactly the same issue, right? Catherine does not help her heir. Catherine does not really empower her heir to understand how to run the country. And from there on, it's all downhill. And so I would say that Elizabeth is a solid ruler. Elizabeth is a quality ruler, but is plagued by the same issues that Russian rulers are plagued with, basically up through the end of the Russian Empire. And as such, this inability to prepare the chain of succession creates a lot of the problems that Catherine runs into and that Catherine herself perpetuates. You mentioned an experienced core of the Swedish army many times. What made them so special?
We're talking about the Grenadiers.
Why couldn't Sweden just prepare more of those? Why did these guys sort of disappear? Well, first off, veterans are just that, right? They're veterans.
Yeah, you can't really just make experience out of thin air. They've obviously fought before.
Hard to come by. They aren't people who are built in a year, right? To really have a veteran army, it takes an army that has been fighting and winning for years and years. If you think about the expansion of the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire is basically
I was thinking the same thing. Really good parallel here.
Built off the core of guys who have been fighting and winning the Punic Wars. And you need decades, literally decades and generations to really build an army where it's just veterans all the way through, where there's thorough experience, where everyone
professional
is,
army
of high morale and highly competent and totally stable under fire, ready to go into these dangerous, terrible combat situations without shaking. So that's one part of it, right? You got this veteran army at the outset of the war who, as just attrition wears them down, as they go through battle after battle and you lose a number of men, you lose these veterans and they have to be replaced with people who have less experience in training. Additionally, on the training front, Charles exploited this thing that was sort of unique to Sweden, this tactic they had. This is in the period where gunpowder arms have basically become the standard, right? Every country is using gunpowder weaponry.
For at least 100 years, right? Almost at this point.
And it makes sense, right? We've moved now from the medieval age to the modern age. But gunpowder weaponry isn't so advanced that it's going to instantly decimate any army, like World War I gunpowder weaponry, right? It is, it's...
All right, fire rate's different. I mean, even before World War I, towards like the Crimean War, or even the Austro-Prussian War is probably where we start to see fire rate become an actual variable success on behalf of the Prussians.
Still a little slow, it's still a little clunky, and Peter's army has this sort of special technique they use, which involves doing what he does so often. It's why he's so aggressive, because their technique is to engage in hand-to-hand combat. They realize that if they can have a gunpowder army like the other gunpowder armies that is highly trained, highly disciplined, good fire discipline, good firepower, but that they can get one volley off and then charge in after the opponent has fired their first volley, between that shot and like the time it takes them to reload. Once they get to hand, because they're really trained in hand-to-hand.
I mean, they should, we just watched a video of Gustavus Adolphus that had this exact, I guess this exact tactic where they would shoot volley, and then in between you would have mounts or you know, saber held individual infantry that would attack in between the shots. So yeah,
they can just totally destroy these other armies. And since we've moved to a gunpowder system, nobody's wearing heavy armor anymore, right? Nobody's wearing all the defensive stuff we had invented to prevent hand-to-hand combat. So it's an interesting turning point in history, and nobody's really maintaining a lot of like pikemen any longer, like the old pike and shot system, because we're not worried about cavalry charges. And since it's all gunpowder, they realized that they could exploit.
Really, there's no cavalry charges at this time?
Exploit that in some ways by engaging hand-to-hand. That also takes training. That's a very hard thing to do, to run into basically a bunch of guys shooting at you. And so that takes veteran troops who are not going to shake at that. And then finally, we talked a little bit about the Swedish Empire not being that economically strong. And so it's kind of like Civ or like a Total War game when you build up a big army, but it's draining your whole treasury. they couldn't afford to instantly rebuild that army, right? Once it was lost, they had spent so much on it and had been draining them for so long that especially without further spoils of war, they couldn't just turn around and hire that many men again, especially since they were from less populous parts of Europe. Here's a suggestion: Parallel History Extra History Edition. Wow. A series where you folks compare and contrast historical figures from same or similar eras like Catherine the Great or Suleiman the Magnificent. And I think this is actually awesome. This is something I totally think about doing if you guys ever want to suggest it on the patron suggestions. Because it really comes from where the core of extra history itself comes from, which is Plutarch. When looking at history, there's a lot of different ways to approach thinking about history and delivering history. And one of those ways is about facts and dates and numbers, right? And
which is probably most of the commonality, I mean, of what people think about whenever they think of history. It's dates, people, dates, countries, battles, wars.
Just the pure what went on. Another way is this way that I actually have a lot of respect for, but which is not an art thing. This is real historians who are going and digging out the minutia so we have all the details, right? Who are making sure that we know all the bit part players, making sure that we have the history of that small monastery somewhere out in the hinterlands of France, that sort of thing. And then there's this idea that I feel like really comes from Plutarch. Plutarch was this guy who sort of is the father of biography, and he wrote this book called The Parallel Lives of Greeks and Romans, often known as Plutarch's Lives, where he would take a famous leader.
Hold on, I'm real time. We're gonna say, when is Plutarch? I'm guessing like it's going to be probably 200 BC. See. Interesting. So it's like the Imperial Roman time. Why can we Earth, death? I'm using ChatGPT. 46 AD, 1819. Okay. Yeah, so like this would be within the first dynasty of the Imperial Rome. So okay.
And another famous leader. And he would write a biography of one and then a biography of the other and juxtapose them. So that way you had to sort of think about the two and how they related to each other.
I like that too.
And think about both the
we do that no matter what. We always compare, like, for example, Mustache Man, anyone in modern time that is any substantial concretion of evil, we always relate them to dead people. That's kind of like I said, juxtapose. Like that's kind of like our immediate, like, human nature of comparing. Like, for example, you go get a bite to eat, well, you're going to compare it to places you've had before, and then you utilize a hierarchical system to determine in a categorization way what is fitting S tier, what is F tier, whatever. So it's human nature. But I like how Plutarch, I need to learn more about him.
Positive and negative aspects of each and what we can learn from them and how their lives and the difference between their lives can inform how we see the world today and how we live our own lives. And that to me is something that I believe in with history. I believe that history's job is to serve as a lens for us to think about the things that are going on for us today. And so would I do a parallel history sort of extra history episode? Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, I might even be willing to do a commentary episode as a one-off where when we do some of these, like Justinian, Suleiman or something, if we have some spare space, we can talk about the differences and the similarities and what it means. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. Along those lines, would you do an episode about a king in Southeastern Asia? Sure. Anything that you guys suggest as patrons.
Yeah, I would have to learn.
is something that we'd be very, very happy to do. So hopefully, yeah, come in, submit that, and if not, jump on the patron Q&A at the end of the month, and I'm happy to talk about any of these kings, and I'd love to hear about some of them because there's probably some that you know a lot more about than I do. Let's see, what else? Oh, since you did the development of writing, could you do similar ideas like the development of medicine in the ancient world? And food, like which foods were available and how they were cooked? And I know this is straying a little bit, but this is the sort of question that we get a lot.
There's a really good channel that we haven't done any videos on yet, but it's like the cooking through history or something like that, where certain meals within certain historical events and or time frames. You guys know the channel I'm talking about most likely, but it's so interesting. I'd love to kind of like try that food myself, like cook it and react to the video. I'd love that.
In the comment stream. So yes, one, if you guys vote for it, absolutely. And two, this history of writing episodes sort of come from an interest of mine. Because they were one-offs, they're the things that I get to just choose to run and do. I had a lot of knowledge about the history of writing because it's just a topic that I've read about, that I'm interested in, that I kind of find fascinating because I feel like it really changed the world. These are topics that obviously change the world as well, but I don't know very much about ancient medicine. I have a pretty good sense of the history of medicine from the beginning of the era of modern medicine.
Wouldn't a lot of like ancient medicine also, I'm just way off course here, like wouldn't that also relate to shamanism a little bit? I'm not sure. That's just a random throw at the wall, but more or less like medicinal, like obviously.
But ancient medicine, I'd love to learn about. I don't know enough yet. And the same with food. I know some about the history of agriculture, but I really don't know much about the history of cooking or food. So
likewise,
I would just have to study those. But you've given me something interesting to go look into. So there's that. There's one more off-topic one, but I think is really good. So it's pretty clear by now that you guys want to do a series on the 7 Years' War. All I'm going to add is when you do, be sure to save a video for the War of Austrian Succession. And for any of you guys who know, the 7 Years' War is really what I would consider to be the first truly world war, the first global war.
Oh, I agree with that, though. I do know about that.
And I think there's a group of these wars as we're sort of entering the modern era, right, in the 18th and 19th century, that lead us very directly to World War I, which, in my opinion, influences and really sort of gives us a path towards almost everything that's going on today.
Yeah.
And yet we very rarely look at some of these earlier conflicts.
I mean, it's a butterfly effect. I mean, the 7 Years' War has a predecessor conflict and all the way back to the Bronze Age. Like, there's always it's a butterfly effect. And that's the beautiful thing about history, is a tapestry. So you're able to kind of like follow the breadcrumbs. Things don't just exist.
And how they played out across the globe and how they changed life all around the globe. And so yes, I would love eventually, it would be amazing if we did this for a bunch more years, to do the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, all these sort of things, the War of Spanish Succession, where once we've had them, once we've done them all, we could put together a video playlist and show this progress, that this conflict that kept happening while we were trying to figure out what is the modern world, and while everyone was jockeying for position as we were exiting sort of, at least for Europe, the feudal world and entering our present day, very different sort of society. Which is perfect because it gives me a good segue. I don't know if I can cover it in lies. Guess I can. But can you give us an idea of how Charles could have affected the War of the Spanish Succession?
Not too sure about this, so this should be an interesting learning bit.
So there was this point in all of this, which, as I mentioned early on, Charles was not the most diplomatic of fellows.
No.
And the Western European powers asked him to become the arbiter of the Spanish succession because, again, the Spanish king didn't really have an heir. There were lots of claimants to it. There are options for lots of different countries to take this over, so everybody's gonna come into conflict over it. One of the things that very much could have happened is Charles, as a neutral arbiter, they sort of asked him to come in because he's got this really powerful country that, at least if you look at Sweden at the time, right, for generations now, for a couple of kingships, they've been on the rise, they've been growing, they've got a super powerful army. Nobody really is seeing the cracks in the Swedish system, the economic weakness, the population weakness. And so they asked him to come in and become the arbiter of this. I think we might even be able to avoid the war because to everyone at the time, whoever's scales he puts his fingers on, if he was to come in on anybody's side, that's who's winning that war. And in doing so, I think he could have made powerful allies in Western Europe and prevented some of what happens later where all of Western Europe gangs up against him, along with basically all the rest of Europe. And so I
Interesting point.
do think that Charles had this moment where he could have become the arbiter of sort of diplomacy in Europe. And had he chosen that rather than to attack the Russians, I think this whole thing, and I think Swedish power in general, plays out very differently, at least over the next 50 to 100 years. Oh, this is a good one to end on. So how terrible exactly was Charles's wound?
I'm guessing we're talking about the foot because, I mean, the other one he died. He was immortal.
I'm not sure which wound you're talking about. If you're talking about his foot wound, it was really gross. Like
This has to be the foot wound because the other one's, I mean, it's on his face.
Shot went straight through his foot and like ended up embedded by his toe. And
Bro, like, can you imagine, like, surgically, you just have to cut your toe off, really? How'd they get that out?
and he still was moving around, right? And so every description I've gotten out of it was super gross. But he did survive it, and he was back walking. He wasn't permanently crippled. He probably would have limped, but he wasn't permanently crippled by it. He continued to try and lead his army. If you're talking about his final wound, his shot to the head, this one, there's a ton of conspiracy theories around.
Oh, like that was friendly fire?
I didn't really put them into the show because one, I felt like it would break the flow, and two, they've exhumed Charles like 3 or 4 times now. And they did it once at the beginning of what we would consider modern forensics, right? And so they pretty much debunked all the conspiracy theories. And if you want to see a really gnarly picture of Charles's wound, on Wikipedia there is a picture of the exit wound for his head, and I mean it's pretty massive. But the reason I bring that up is because forensics says that this had to be a shot going at high speed, basically fired down from some of the defensive works.
Yeah, the conspiracy has to be friendly fire.
On the other side. There's these whole wild conspiracy theories about that it was one of his own army, one of his own soldiers who shot him. There was nobody around him really at the time, at least none of the commanders, none of the like notable people, so no one saw the shot. So everyone thought it came from the opposing side, but especially as the empire crumbled and Charles gets, rightly in a lot of ways, blamed for a lot of things because it is his arrogance and his hubris that causes all this collapse and caused all this harm in the first place. People say things like, weirdly, that one of his own soldiers shot a button, like a button from his uniform, at Charles and killed him. There's some other conspiracy theories about very clandestine plots, but it is a very large head wound that, as far as my understanding goes, from everything that I've read, when exhumed and looked at through relatively modern forensic techniques, it's almost certain that he was not shot by his own side and that he was in fact killed by a random bullet from the opposing defensive works.
Seems like it was a sharpshooter.
So with that, I am going to go and take a few minutes to gather myself and find some peace before I have to rush off to my next thing because I am traveling overseas again. But I hope you all enjoyed getting to hear a few of your fellow extra history.
Was awesome. Cinema, as always. Extra History did an amazing job here. Really interesting. I love these casual sit downs. Like, so we're definitely going to do the lies continuously after we do Extra History videos. There's a ton. There's a ton. So let me know below which one that we should do next. This was a very interesting window into a time and a place where I had little to no understanding of things of existence within this time and period. So it was fun to get the baselines from Extra History. I know there's a lot of detailed history videos out there that kind of go a little bit deeper, so interested in kind of diving into that as well. Thank you for being here. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Until next time, out and bye-bye.